Good evening, everyone. If you want to head on over to Job chapter 1, that's where we'll be beginning, along with kind of towards the first of the month, as I've been doing. I see where we're at in the reading plan and kind of try to do a sermon from that area of the Bible. And we're actually, this week is on the reading plan is right finishing up the end of Job. So this past week technically was over the whole book of Job. And so we're going to kind of do a lesson from Job, and I've done a lesson about Job before, kind of just as really a sub-point. And this is going to be more of like one of those lessons where I try to give you a little bit of a roadmap. Job can be a pretty dense and confusing book, so we'll be going through kind of the main points, main themes, main takeaways, and then a kind of an outline of the book as a whole. It's good to be back with you all. I was on a trip with some friends in the Smokies, just a kind of a reunion from college, and we had a good time. It was a really nice isolated cabin in the mountains. Like you wake up, it's like 57 degrees, and it's like a misty morning. Very, very wonderful. So there's your weather forecast of the Smoky Mountains last week. But and then Robert and Quinn were kind enough to also let me stay a couple days longer and stay in Atlanta and go to a friend's wedding. And I also was able to visit my Uncle Sewell while I was there, which was really, really nice because he's an old warrior, so he's fading out. Not gonna probably have him too much longer. And it was really nice to get breakfast and talk with him and also catch up just with family and spend time with them there. They that side of the family, it's really unique. Because my dad is the one that passed away, and that whole side of the family is my dad's side of the family. And so when he passed away, they didn't just like kind of become distant. It actually like drew us all like closer together. And they like the whole Hall side of the family like really provided a lot of close family bonds like during that time. And my cousins that I stayed with actually took us on a trip to the beach whenever like within the few months after my dad passed away, just to like kind of keep us moving and keep us with family. And well, sorry, that's a little somber, but I mean it kind of goes along with the topic. But when here's a happy story for you. That they told me a story that I actually didn't know until this past visit with them. That while we were at the beach that time, my cousin Barry really kind of his long-winded prayers. And when he finished a prayer one time, I guess, for the food or like at the end of like the day or something, and I just said, "That was a long prayer, Cousin Barry." And my mom took me out and she like was like, "Pa, pa," kind of laid into me. And I came back and I was like rubbing my behind and my eyes at the same time. And I was like, she was like, "What do you say to him?" And I said, "Cousin Barry, I'm sorry your prayer was so long." And I think the laugh that I got out of them didn't lead to further administration of punishment. But loved them a lot and very thankful for the time there this past week. To begin tonight, diving right into the book of Job, let's just start with kind of an overview. It's a really unique book because when it comes to the read-through of the Bible, if you start in Genesis, you really have an unbroken chain from Genesis to the end of 1st or 2nd Chronicles of narrative, like just telling you the story of Israel. There's some few pauses in there for some ancient blueprints and laws, but mainly it's of just one big story. And it's all about Abraham, it's all about his family, it's about the Israelites, it's about Moses leading him, it's about the kings, it's about David, it's about the monarchy. And you get to Job, and Moses is not here. David's nowhere to be found, not to be mentioned. Abraham, hardly know him. Israelites, they're gone. Like we don't have any hardly words of them at all. And look at how it opens in Job chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. He was a blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil." Saying the land of Uz or the land of Uz is this only mentioned like one other time, this area of the world. It's probably in the region of Edom, but honestly, we don't really know. It's essentially the same thing as saying now in a land far, far away, or the way this book opens, like saying in a galaxy far, far away. Like this is taking place way far away somewhere else, totally separate and apart from the larger Bible story that you're usually sitting in. And so, it's just in that sense, it's very strange. Like there's nothing else to be said about that. There's no kind of the main characters that we've grown familiar with and the main storyline that we're connected to. Now, God, Yahweh God, is mentioned many, many a times. In fact, this book has the largest speech of God in chapters 38 through 41 that we'll talk about. That's kind of where we'll end the sermon tonight. But other thing that's really interesting is this book reads like a play. There's Job took up his discourse, and then his friend begins to speak, and then Job responds to that friend, and then the next friend speaks. In fact, let me just draw it out for you real quick. So if you will, look into chapter 2, look down at verse 11. Here's we're introduced to another set of characters. So we've got Job, who's lost everything, and he's sitting down in the dust, kind of on his knees, with his hands out crying. And then he's got three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. All of these are contenders for my firstborn name on these lists. We've got Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and then Job here in the middle. And it goes like this. Eliphaz always goes, he's the first one that starts to speak to Job. And then after him, Bildad speaks, Job responds. And then after him, Zophar speaks, and Job responds. And then it starts over. It's actually really structured throughout the first 26 chapters or so. That's probably wrong, but I have an outline that we'll look at here in a second. But basically, it's like there's just this long discourses between the three of them. And this is the first large section of the book. The other thing to keep in mind, and when this was pointed out to me, this really was kind of like the key that unlocked the book, is the book of Job's triangle of wisdom. So the thing that they're wrestling with is three different things. So you've got that Job is suffering. I really tried to have all of this on there, but I rage quit it. So it's not on there, and I couldn't get it to cooperate. But you've got Job is suffering, right? That's kind of box number one. You've got also Job's righteousness that's in question. Is Job actually a righteous man that we just read about because all of this terrible stuff is happening to him? And then you've got God's righteousness here at the top. These three things kind of form the triangle of the arguments in the book. Because in the eyes of Job and his friends, only two of these can be true at the same time. Okay? So Job is suffering, God is righteous, therefore Job is not righteous. And then God is righteous, and if Job is righteous, then Job shouldn't be suffering. And then a couple times throughout the book, Job is the only one that considers this because he's wrestling in the pain, is he's suffering and he knows that he's righteous. And we as the readers also know that he's righteous. He's truly blameless. And so that brings him into question of, well, what is God doing? Where is he at? Is God righteous? Like Job goes to dare to venture into that question. And these are kind of the three main things that are in tension in this book. I hope y'all can see that pretty well. I'm going to probably leave that up the whole time. So if you want to get a better look at it afterwards, you can. So it's a unique book. It reads, it's very structured. It kind of reads like a play. At least that's how I imagine it in my mind. It's like a stage play. It kind of helps me remember who's in charge, what's going on, who's speaking. And then this triangle of the wisdom of Job here. This tension of God's righteousness, Job's righteousness, and Job's suffering. Because we read here in chapter 1, and that's where we'll look now, is at the structure of the book. Here in Job chapters 1 and 2, we have the intro. Verses 1 that we just read is how Job is actually a blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. He's a wealthy man. He has a big family. And he's so righteous that he will get up in the morning and in fear that maybe perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts, he will get up in the morning to offer sacrifices to atone for them as well. And so Job is like cream of the crop. Like he's like everything that like we're hopefully going to attain to be. And there's only a few people in the Bible who are described as righteousness and blameless. That's like a description of the sacrificial lambs. They were supposed to be blameless. And then we have a scene cuts in chapter 6, or in chapter 1, verse 6. And suddenly the scene shifts, and we're like in God's heavenly courtroom. And we see all of the sons of God, which are these spiritual beings, gather around him. And then there's this one there that shows up called Satan. And it's in it's a title here. There's a word Satan, it means accuser. And so what does he do? But he comes up and he begins to accuse. And he says that he's questioning about the way that God runs the world. He says, look at Job, though. He's like, you've just put a hedge around him and protected him. And that's why he worships you, is because you've made him really wealthy, because he does all this good stuff. And so God says, well, all that he has is now in your hand. And so Satan goes out from this presence. And what does he do? But he takes all of Job's possessions, he takes all of his children and all of his goods, and Job falls down in the dust, and he says in chapter 1, verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. Yahweh gave, Yahweh is taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. And through all of this, Job did not sin, nor did he give offense to God. And then it's like the scene shifts again. We're back in God's courtroom in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And again, he says, look, God says to the Satan, he says, Job did not sin. He still is faithful to me, even though that you have struck him and taken away all of this. And Satan says to Yahweh, he says in verse 4, skin for skin, yes, all the man has, he has and will give for his life. However, send forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he'll curse you to your face. So Yahweh said to Satan, behold, he's your hand, just spare his life. And so Job is struck with terrible boils, like from the very bottom of his feet to the top of his head, and he takes like a broken piece of a pot shard and scrapes the boils just to find some sort of semblance of relief. And then he has this beautiful proclamation, because his wife is seeing this happen to him, and Job's wife gets a bad rap, but I just want you to think about, like when you see someone in pain, a lot of the times it's kind of hard to know what to say whenever someone is dealing with immense suffering. And she says to him, do you hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. In verse 10 of chapter 2, he says, you speak, and as a wicked, foolish woman speaks. He says, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept calamity? And then again, Job did not sin with his lips. And now we reach the setting that kind of the rest of the book takes place in. Because Job's 3 friends, they come to him. And look at what happens. They come to console and to comfort him. And in verse 12 of chapter 2, they lift up their eyes at a distance, and they didn't recognize him. Like, that's how far that Job has come down from. He's unrecognizable, marred beyond appearance. And they lift up their voices and they wept, and each one tore his clothes. They threw dust over their heads towards the sky, and they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one spoke a word, for they saw that his pain was very great. And then now that's the intro. Kind of that's the setting that we're sitting, we've put up the scene, and now the discourses are going to begin. The intro and the outro bracket this main body section of the book, 42 chapters in Job. And the outro is most of this is poetry, and what we just read was a lot of narrative, but then at the very end of the book, the outro is again a little section of narrative where it talks about the final interactions between Job and his friends and Job's restoration. And then, as I talked about, this starts to go on. Job, as you see there in chapter 3, Job begins to speak. Eliphaz responds to him. Job responds to Eliphaz. Bildad takes up his speech. Job responds to Bildad. Zophar takes up his speech. Job responds to Zophar, and then back through it again. It goes through it 3 times, and it kind of just starts to degrade. It's like the 3 times the friends, they kind of start to make up sins that Job must have done. They start to say like you kicked puppies and beat up orphans. Literally, they say that you've cursed the widow and you've abused the orphans. And he's like, no, I haven't. I have not done any of this. I am righteous. And if I could talk to God, I would lay out my case before him. And so it goes through these 3 rounds. And then by the end of it, actually, a little disclaimer is the last guy, Zophar, he doesn't even get a word on the 3rd round through this. Eliphaz has a speech. Bildad has one really short chapter. And then Zophar doesn't even get a final word on that last round. Then after that, there's 3 large monologues. Job takes the first one in chapters 27 through 31. It's kind of like his final, it's at the end of it, he says, I've signed my name. It's like he's signing off on his final proclamation and his final word. And he says, like, this is the last of what I'm going to say on this, and I'm done. The Most High can answer me if he wants to. And then, mysteriously, let's turn over and look at this. Go to chapter 32 really quick. It says, 32 verse 1 says, Then these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. And then it says, The anger of Elihu, the son of Barachel, of Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned against Job, and his anger burned because he was proving himself righteous before God. This guy, Elihu, has not been mentioned until this chapter. He just kind of shows up out of nowhere. And he has like 6 chapters of a long monologue where he kind of takes a different perspective than Job's friends. He kind of begins to present a unique facet and angle on the conversation. And it's very interesting because afterwards, when God rebukes Job's friends for how they were speaking about him and how they were speaking to Job, he doesn't mention Elihu. Elihu just appears right here in chapter 32, and then he vanishes after chapter 37. And he just leaves his wisdom with them. But he's frustrated that there's no answers being brought to. And he seems, I believe it says that, yes, he was a younger guy. Look at verse 4. It says, Now Elihu had waited with his words for Job because they were years older than he was. But then Elihu saw there was no answer on the mouth of the 3 men, so his anger burned. And so he starts to speak. And I remember, there's different ways you can take this. I'll just present both of them, and or at least the 2 that I've heard, and you can make up your own mind. Some see Elihu as kind of a young buck who's like speaking up really presumptuously, and God's not mentioning of him is kind of just God kind of brushing his comments off to the side. I see it as he's kind of got a unique perspective on this because of his youth. And I remember it was in a Bible class that on Job that Shane Scott was teaching, where he actually took the other point of view on Elihu, that he was kind of more of a prideful young buck. And I was giving a little pushback because I was like, some of this stuff he's saying is making sense. And so it was like we were like embodying those 2 characters, me and the teacher Shane Scott, in that moment. And on that Sunday, I was like wearing a bow tie as well in Bible class, and then whenever I said, I think he's making some good points, I don't know if I agree with what you're saying there, Shane just paused and he says, Now everyone, don't you think that Elihu would have been a bow tie wearer? And I was like, all right, man. I was like, come on now. And then this was a total accident, but here we are. Anyways, I wore this now. But those are kind of the 2 perspectives. Go forth and read it, meditate on your own time, draw your own conclusions. But I think he gives kind of a unique angle on the tension of this triangle that we were talking about over here. But that's the second monologue. And then third and finally, of course, is Yahweh himself shows up in the final chapters 38 through 41. He comes and he responds to Job's call to have a conversation, to lay out his case before him. And God responds to that. So now on to some key features about the book. First off is the law of reaping and sowing. So what do I mean by this? Hold your finger here. Go over to Galatians, like all the way over to Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6. Paul actually kind of talks about this here. He says in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. For one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. The one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And do not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap a harvest if we do not grow weary. And the law of reaping and sowing is essentially that. Basically, what you do is also what you will harvest. And so Job's friends are over here like, well, you must be obviously sowing in the wrong fields because you're reaping suffering and loss. And then Job's like, no, that's not at all how I'm actually living. And you'll see this idea of reaping and sowing show up many a times. Job seems like he also has that kind of point of view, but he starts to wonder now. And as we mentioned before, it's got him into question of where is God in all of this, that I'm in this pain and in this suffering. If you want to go and look at Job chapter 4, turn over to Job chapter 4. And this is an example of the law of reaping and sowing. This is the first speech of Eliphaz when he's responding to Job for the first time. In Job chapter 4 and verse 8, actually let's start in verse 7. It says, remember now, who has ever perished, being innocent? Or where were the upright wiped out? According to what I have seen, those who plow wickedness and those who sow trouble harvest it. By the breath of God they perish, and by the wind of his anger they come to an end. And so, as you're reading through this, keep an eye out for that. I know we're nearing the end, but maybe you're a few days behind on the reading program, like I am. So, as you're reading through it, keep an eye on that, on the law of reaping and sowing. The other thing is the creation imagery. This one is critical to God's speeches towards the end. But throughout the entire book, all of the friends kind of call on it. If you're still in chapter 4, just look down at the next verse. He says, the roaring of the lion and the fierce lion and the teeth of the young lions are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the whelps of the lioness are scattered. A young lion is kind of an example of like an enemy, an analogy here. So he's using this imagery of like an enemy that's trying to pounce on you like a lion, and God breaks their teeth. He perishes, the wicked perish in the day that he blows his breath upon them. And then, if you will, turn over to chapter 9. This is now Job. He's speaking for the third time in response to his third friend. Or, excuse me, I think this one is in response to Bildad. And he says, and we'll recognize a few of these phrases later, but look at verse 9 starting in verse 3. He says, if one desired to contend with him, that is, God, he could not answer him once 1,000 times. He says, the wise in heart, mighty in power, who has stiffened his neck against him and been at peace? God is the one who removes the mountains, they know not how. He overturns them in his anger. The one who shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble. The one who says for the sun not to shine and sets a seal upon the stars, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled down the waves of the sea, who makes the bear, Orion, the Pleiades, and the chambers of the south, and who does great things, unsearchable and wondrous works, innumerable. Were he to sweep by me, I would not see him. Were he to move past me, I would not perceive him. Were he to snatch me away, who could turn him back? Who could say to him, what are you doing? And so Job here is meditating on God's like immaculate design in creation. And then he's saying that all of this he's just swept by me. Like he's missed me. And one thing to kind of, another little note is as you're reading through Job, you're listening to arguments. So like Job will say something and a friend will rebuttal. So just like it's going to sound a little schizophrenic sometimes, one thing and then the opposite. But just pay attention to who's speaking when and where. And also Job even sometimes, you can feel him in the midst of his pain, because he'll say something like this, like there's moments where he's like, God is all powerful, and he is in control of the sun and the stars. And then other times, well, let's just look at the next page. And it seems he takes on more of an accusatory tone in chapter 9, beginning in verse 22. It is all one, therefore I say, he consumes the blameless and the wicked. Whoa. Like Job's saying that God is taking out the blameless and the wicked. And then if the scourge puts to death suddenly, he mocks the despair of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked, and he covers the face of its judges. If it is not he, then who is it? And so Job's like wrestling with this. Like he's been sitting in dust and ashes for multiple days. And he's wrestling with who could be someone would he come to visit me and I could plead my case before him? Or perhaps we could get a mediator, but who's going to mediate between Job and Yahweh? Look down into verse 32 and 33. He says, for he is not a man as I am, that I may answer him, that I may go to court for judgment together, and there's no adjudicator between us, who may lay his hand on both of us. And so Job is crying out for someone to be able to mediate, but there's no one. And so I mentioned this point already, but whenever we're reading through this, just keeping in mind our perspective. Like we saw that scene in the heavenly courtroom. Like we kind of have a unique perspective that, well, Job doesn't have. He doesn't see what's going on. And what you'll notice by the end of the book, he's never told about what happened in that courtroom scene in heaven either. He doesn't hear about that. And so, in conclusion, let's turn all the way to the end of the book. Go to Job chapter 38. And then we'll wrap it up here with the final speech from God. So in the midst of all of this, like pain, suffering, the tension, the questioning, eventually the no answers. Like they just don't get anywhere through all of their discussion. To the frustration of Elihu, God finally appears himself. And in chapter 38, verse 1, then Yahweh answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he says, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you will make me know. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who set its measurements, since you know, or who stretched a line upon it, and where were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstones when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who enclosed the sea with its doors? When it bursting forth, it went out from the womb. When I made the cloud its garments, a dense gloom is its swaddling band. And I placed boundaries on it. And I set a bolt and doors. And I said, thus far you shall come, but no farther. And here your proud waves will stop. So when it comes to this conversation that's now being wrapped up by God himself, speaking from a whirlwind, like a dust storm or a tornado. When he's speaking out of this whirlwind, what does he begin his opening discourse of this monologue? Well, he has Job again look out on the creation and just like meditate on it. And what did we just read? He actually kind of uses some of Job's own words. And in fact, if you look over into the verse 31 of the same chapter, he asks Job, he says, can you bind the chains of Pleiades, or loose the cords or the belt of Orion? Can you lead forth the constellation in its seasons and guide the bear with all of her cubs? Do you know the statutes of the heavens, or do you fix their rule over the earth? So he actually goes through the very same constellations that we just read Job talk about earlier. What God's doing here is he's kind of, when we're in the pain, like it's very clear that pain is very real. Like whenever you're in serious mental or physical suffering. Like, you stub your toe walking through the dark in the middle of the night, and your whole body is very aware that your pinky toe has just been obliterated, right? But pain shrinks our vision, I think, is kind of a little miniature example of what happens there. So what does God do to Job? It's like, we're going to go on a tour of, the universe. And he says, I'm in control of this stuff, and I've got it. And he actually reminds him, he quotes a lot of the same things that Job says. I'm in control of these things. Pleiades, Orion, the constellations, the boundaries of the oceans, the heights of the mountains, the depths of the valleys. It's like, I'm seeing and I'm watching all of that. And it's kind of like a snap out of it kind of thing for a moment there. I think there is an intensity to this speech here that God opens with. But then turn over to chapter 39. What we see here is then, while it was really big and expansive, go to chapter 41. Because we saw how God was showing him all of the large part of creation. And then now in chapter 41, we see him talk about this strange creature. All of chapter 41 is this really long poem about this creature called the Leviathan that God just brags about. He thinks it's awesome. He thinks it's amazing. He's like, I created it, and also I control it. It's in my command. Just look at this thing. Chapter 41, starting in verse 1. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down its tongue with a cord? Can you open a rope on its, or can you put a rope in its nose, or pierce its jaws with a hook? And then he says, verse 7, can you fill its skin with harpoons and its head with fishing spears? He says, reach out your hand upon it and remember that battle. You will not do it again. And listen to this thing. Look at verse 18. Still describing the same creature. It sneezes, flash forth light. And its eyelid is like the eyelid of the morning. I think of have you ever seen a video of one of those giant squids, just one big eyeball on the side? This thing's got this huge eye of the morning. It's like a sunrise when it opens. And then look, verse 19. Out of its mouth go burning torches, and sparks of fire leap forth. Out of its nostrils smoke goes forth, and from a boiling pot and burning reeds. Its breath kindles the coals, and flames go forth from its mouth. Wherever this thing is, they're not around anymore. We don't got this thing. Some sort of fire-breathing, like, sea monster is what we're looking at here. It talks about how it swims in the water, and it makes the water look like it has white hair because the steam is, like, going up from it. This is a mighty, dangerous, terrifying creature. It talks about how iron is like straw, bronze is rotten wood, sling stones, arrows, clubs, it just laughs at them. It's like this mighty, terrible creature. And God is just like, look at it. I made that, and I'm in control of it. What does that say? Well, it tells me that God is king over the chaos. And how would that comfort Job right now? Like in the midst of everything he's dealing with. Like just like that. Over we don't know how much time, but all these messengers came running to him at once, and then soon after that, again, he lost his health. He lost all of his possessions and his health in this tiny span of time. Like that's chaotic. That's chaos. That's the waters of death that God that God parts the waters that rescued the Israelites. That's those collapsing in and destroying Pharaoh's armies, but now it's a righteous man who's being destroyed by those waters of chaos. And what God says is, see this terrifying, dangerous creature that'll kill you in an instant? I've got my eye on it, and I'm taking care of it, and I can control it. And then turn over the page, because I want to read Job's final response here to God's speech. In chapter 42, verse 1, it says, Then Job answered Yahweh and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. He says, Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Quoting God. He says, Therefore I have declared what I did not understand, things too marvelous for me, which I did not know. Here now I will speak, and here I will ask of you, and you will make me know. Again, quoting God. And then what does Job say here in verse 5? He says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, and now my eye sees you. Therefore I reject myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. Okay, so I want to talk about this for a second, because this word repent in verse 6, it is used 6 other times. So there's seven times in the book of Job. Every other time it's used, it's translated comforted, which is so strange to me. And again, this isn't something I noticed on my own. Smarter people who know the language and stuff pointed this out. But I guess we use this, we translate it repent because of talking about dust and ashes afterwards. But dust and ashes is also very interesting. It's used those two phrases together, dust and ashes, are used in Genesis chapter 3, and Genesis 18 verse 27, 1 Samuel 2 verse 8, and Psalm 113 verse 7. You know what all those have in common? It's talking about your smallness, your mortality. God says, to dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Abraham says, who am I to talk with the Most High, I who am but dust and ashes? And then David, when he looks upon himself, when Hannah is singing a song, she describes those who dwell in the dust and ashes, God lifts up. And then in Psalm 113, it's a parallel to Hannah's song. It talks about how God lifts up those who sit in the dust and lifts up the needy from the ash heap. And so Job here, in his dust and in his ashes, I think it would be more accurate to say comforted. And how is he comforted? But his eye sees God. And that's something that is, well, first off, says if you see him, you will perish. In the day that you see him, you will surely die. There's only a few people who are described as maybe seeing God in the Bible. It's Hagar at the well and Moses at Sinai that sees God's back. And Job here says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. And it's in the dust and ashes that Job is comforted, and that he also sees God at his fullest. And that's the thing that's very strange, is the suffering and the comfort, or the suffering and the joy, seem like two things that are on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? I need to be relieved of my suffering to have joy. And when I don't have joy, then I'm suffering and I'm not comforted. But the thing we learned here is that in God, in Yahweh God, the beginning and the end, life and death, suffering, joy, they're not opposites, but they are overlapped and they meet in Yahweh God. And they're embodied in him, and they're ultimately embodied in the cross and in the empty tomb. Right next to each other, only 3 days apart. Ultimate suffering and injustice vindication, and life. Right there. And here in Job, nothing's been restored. Nothing's been found out or answers given to him. All God has told him is that I've got control of these things, and I see you. I'm with you. I'm amongst the pain. I'm not apart from it. And it's in that moment that his eye sees him. And what we see is that Job's complaint in this becomes all of our voices, crying out for an intercessor. And in the book of Job, he reaches like the edge of the mystery of Christ to come. Go back to chapter 10. Look at this. What does he say here in chapter 10? Talking about God. In chapter 10, verse 4, he says, "Have you eyes of flesh, or do you see as a mortal man sees? Are your days as of a mortal man, or your years as a man's years, that you should seek for my guilt and search after my sin? According to your knowledge, I am indeed not wicked, and there is no one to deliver from your hand." And then also, right before this, let's read it again in chapter 9, verse 32. "He's not a man, as I am, that I may answer him, that I may go to court for judgment together. There's no adjudicator between us, who may lay his hand upon both of us." But what do we see in Christ? But the one who came and is able to lay his hands on both of us and be the intercessor between God and man. And in that, he's the embodiment of all of our suffering as well. A man of sorrows, well acquainted with grief. And how is he described in chapter 53? Marred beyond appearance. The thing about, like, I don't have any answers to, like, much more ink has been spilled on, like, the problem of evil, which I think really is more the problem of suffering and pain. But in Jesus, what we do have is a story about a God who does not stand far off from the pain, but entered right down into it and became a part of it. And if it all ended at the cross, if that was the end, we would never have heard of Jesus, right? But it didn't end there. Ultimate joy and ultimate pain were like right there together. Life and death both met at the cross. And so in Jesus, like, we have a resolution, like, to the cry of Job at the end of this book. And it's the God that sits down in the dust and ashes with us. And so I don't have anything else to say. I was trying to write up something to make a nice exclamation point, but I think that's probably it right there. And that's something that's not a nice answer, I think, that you can, like, tie a bow on. But the book of Job, the deep wisdom there, is that God is the eye that sees us. And then through the suffering, our eyes can see him. And so that's the good news, ladies and gentlemen, and that's very good news, is that we have a God that does not stand far off from our pain. So if there's anyone here this evening who maybe you're in the midst of pain, and our pain is Job is a special case. All of us have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. But even in the midst of our sin, and even when we were still enemies, Christ came down and died for us and provided that way of escape by following him down into death and rising up to walk in newness of life. So if there's anyone here who needs to respond tonight, would you please come now as we stand and as we sing.